So it's another day, and you know what that means, everybody? That means it's another day, so it's time for another right-wing assault on the Affordable Care Act. It's time for another right-wing assault on Obamacare. And I have to say, this one is actually fairly problematic and worrying. We're not talking about the GOP House voting to repeal it for a millionth time, wasting time again and again, something that's, frankly inconsequential. However, the threat that came down this week appears to be pretty real and pretty legitimate here. So here's a little bit of background here. So part of the Affordable Care Act, if you're not aware, is setting up these state-based healthcare exchanges, right? It's an easy place for people to compare plans available to them in that state. As most of you are probably aware, 36 states, 36 of our 50 states, chose to not set up their own exchanges. And so the law, Affordable Care Act, has a provision that if a state does not set up a state exchange, a federally run exchange would be established in its place. So that happened in 36 states, most of them run by Republican right-wing governors, right? So part of the Affordable Care Act was giving subsidies to people who were poor in these private healthcare exchanges if they fell below 400% of the poverty line and didn't qualify for Medicaid in their state, which again, many Republican states refused the Medicaid expansion. That was probably the best part of the Affordable Care Act. A lot of Republican states refused that, but still, if you fell within that threshold, that area, you would get a sliding subsidy based on your income to help offset the costs of buying insurance from these healthcare exchanges, right? So that's kind of the guts of Obamacare. So in the Affordable Care Act, apparently there was a typo. Yeah, and that typo has actually set off a series of really unfortunate events. So here's what happened Tuesday at the D.C. Circuit Court of Appeals. I'm going to read from a report from Ian Millhiser from Think Progress, who did a lot of great reporting on this. Again, this is from Think Progress, quote, "Under Halbig v. Burwell, a decision handed down by Judge Raymond Randolph, a Bush 1 appointee, and Judge Thomas Griffith, a Bush 2 appointee, millions of Americans will lose the federal health insurance subsidies provided to them under the Affordable Care Act, or at least they will lose these subsidies if Randolph and Griffith's decision is ultimately upheld on appeal." End quote. So this is bad, folks. This is potentially bad. There's some good news on the horizon, but on its face, this is at the bare minimum very serious, right? This hopefully will be overturned, but this is a serious threat here. So how exactly did this happen? What was this typo in the Affordable Care Act that caused this whole thing to go forth? So reading again from Think Progress, quote, "The plaintiffs in the case uncovered a drafting error in the statute where it appears to limit the subsidies to individuals who obtain insurance through, quote, an exchange established by the state. Randolph and Griffith's opinion concludes that this drafting error is the only thing that matters. In their words, quote, a federal exchange is not an exchange established by the state," end quote. So, according to these two far right-wing judges, focusing on one out-of-context sentence in this entire gigantic law, they are saying that any state, in a nutshell, any state, which there are currently 36 out of 50, any state that did not set up its own state exchange, instead opted for the federal exchange, is actually not eligible for any of the Affordable Care Act subsidies. So what's so nefarious about this is that these judges are clearly looking at that one sentence completely out of context within the rest of the law, which is clearly, if you look at the whole law, of course the subsidies are supposed to go to any exchange, the state exchange or a federally run exchange. Of course it's supposed to be that way because the people who wrote the law actually want people to get these subsidies. It's ridiculous. So Ian Millhiser at Think Progress elaborates on this point. Quote, he says, "Another provision of the law provides that when a state elects not to run an exchange, the Secretary of Health and Human Services, quote, shall establish and operate such exchange within the state, and the Secretary shall take such actions as are necessary to implement such other requirements. Thus, the law not only authorizes the Secretary to stand in the state's shoes when it runs an exchange, it also empowers her to implement the law's, quote, other requirements, end quote. Duh, of course, right? Other requirements, which include these subsidies, which actually make the add the affordable part to the Affordable Care Act. That's the whole point of this, which are, again, required in the law. Other examples that he lists include, quote, the Affordable Care Act requires the federally run exchanges to report various information that they would only be able to report if they were providing subsidies, such as whether taxpayers received a, quote, advance payment of such credit, information needed to determine individuals' eligibility for and amount of such credit, and, quote, information necessary to determine whether a taxpayer has received excess advance payments. Congress would not have imposed these reporting requirements if they thought that the federal exchanges would not offer subsidies, end quote. Right there, in that statute, they're talking about the federal exchanges having to report the subsidies. It's actually, they have a statute in the law about the subsidies, and yet these right-wing judges are focusing on this typo, clearly ignoring the whole entire law. He goes on to write, quote, the Affordable Care Act also provides that the only people who are qualified to purchase insurance at all on a federally run exchange are people who, quote, reside in the state that established the exchange. Thus, if federally run exchanges are not deemed to be established by the state, that means that no one at all is allowed to purchase health insurance on the federally run exchanges, and there will be no purpose whatsoever for their existence, end quote. And of course he's right. Of course he's right. Of course the federal exchanges are supposed to get subsidies. Of course they are. This really is a case of right-wingers grasping at straws. They're grasping at straws here. And the sick thing is, there are a lot of right-wing judges who are happy to let those right-wingers drink from those straws. I realize I'm mixing straw metaphors here. One I think is like straws, like hay straws, and the other one's like a drink straw. But you get my point here, right? I'm mixing straw metaphors, but you get my overall point. What's even crazier is that there is established legal precedent, that goes all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States, that you do not strike down a law for what appears to be an obvious typo and mistake, which again, this absolutely clearly is. When you look at the rest of the law, it clearly is just a small typo. So there's also precedent going all the way up to the Supreme Court again, but that when there is ambiguity on a certain part of the law, the Supreme Court and other courts have actually determined that what you're supposed to do is let the regulatory agency that's charged with enforcing that law dictate the reading of the law. In this case, it would be the IRS. Right there in that part of the statute, they talk about the IRS. This law is, the subsidies are tied in with the IRS, right? So they even talk about it in that law. So again, they're ignoring that precedent as well. And, it's not even just the law. They had agency people actually testifying to these right-wing judges at this case, and that of course the federally run exchanges are supposed to get subsidies. Of course it is. And these two right-wing judges completely ignored that precedent, and they ignored the testimony in front of them. So that's the bad news. The good news is the fight's not over on this at all. So obviously, the government is going to appeal this ruling here. And then what would happen, it's going to go to this is a three-judge panel that did this, voted this 2-1. What would happen if they appeal? Theoretically, what's going to happen, it's going to go to the full D.C. Circuit Court, and currently the Democrat judges have a 7-4 majority there, so they could shut this down on appeal just at the D.C. Circuit alone. Also, later on that same day, that same Tuesday, when this ridiculous ruling came in, the Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals in Virginia, that court was also hearing a case on this typo, right? And the Fourth Circuit Court actually ruled unanimously the exact opposite of what the D.C. Circuit Court ruled. In their ruling, one of the justices wrote, quote, with only 16 state-run exchanges currently in place, the economic framework supporting the act would crumble if the credits were unavailable on federal exchanges. Furthermore, without an exception to the individual mandate, millions more Americans unable to purchase insurance without the credits would be forced to pay a penalty that Congress never envisioned imposing on them. The IRS rule avoids both of these unforeseen and undesirable consequences and thereby advances the true purpose and means of the act. End quote. Or to put it another way, duh. Of course that's what it is. Of course that's what it is. So, look, what happens next? So, for starters, the government will appeal, and then the full DC Circuit could theoretically overrule it. There's also other cases on this bird going in like Oklahoma and another place, so this isn't entirely done. So it could get turned over at the DC Circuit of Appeal. If it doesn't, the Fourth Circuit ruling could also get appealed, and then these could theoretically go to the Supreme Court. And while any reasonable justice would laugh this out of court, I'm pretty sure we all know that the majority of the Supreme Court, as they currently stand, are not what we would call reasonable. They are right-wing extremists, right? We all know this. We know what happened in the last round of Supreme Court rulings. So what would happen, theoretically, if this ruling somehow stands at the appeal level and even gets held up by the Supreme Court? What would theoretically happen? Think Progress has a short list of what would happen if this is held. So, quote, almost 90% of Obamacare enrollees in states with federal marketplaces would lose their tax credits. Premiums in those states would increase by more than 75%. The average person with the cheapest plan on a federal marketplace would have to spend a quarter of their income on insurance. The number of uninsured Americans would increase by almost 6.5 million people. Obamacare premiums as a whole would be sent into a death spiral. End quote. And it's not only that. It wouldn't just affect that 6.5 million people. If this were to go through, everyone's rates would go up. They would. Everyone's rates would go up because of this. So this is potentially very, very dangerous. You know, we'll have to see how it shakes out. Hopefully the DC Circuit knocks it down, but you never know. You never know when you have all these crazy right-wing judges all across the country. So the last kind of big point I want to make on this whole thing is when I'm reading this story and watching how this rolls out, I want us to think about this as progressives for a second and think about how this is very clearly another example of why adopting right-wing solutions to big problems is always, at least almost always, but I'm going to say it's always a horrible idea. It's always a horrible idea. Regular listeners know I'm not actually a huge fan of the Affordable Care Act. I'm not. I don't want to repeal it. So let me be very clear. I don't want it repealed. I don't want it gone now that it's been passed. But as I've said time and time again here on this show, if you want to establish universal health care in America, the Affordable Care Act is probably the most convoluted, complicated, stupidest way to actually achieve universal health care, or at least near universal health care that the act is supposed to do. It's so convoluted. It's so stupid. It's also at its core, a right-wing plan. We all know this. The blueprints of the individual mandate, the subsidies, all of that is actually from a Heritage Foundation plan. This is essentially Romney Care, which is a right-wing plan. Obamacare is a right-wing healthcare plan before right-wingers decided to fight every single solitary thing that Obama did, right? So, look, adopting these right-wing answers are actually coming back to bite us in the ass here. It's coming back to potentially destroy this law. Look, another example of this. So Obamacare gave the religious exemption, right, for things like birth control. That exemption was actually blown up into the Hobby Lobby decision, right? I mean, so not that the Hobby Lobby decision makes sense even with the exemption. Obviously, it's crazy right-wing rulings, right? But they tried to cater to the right wing and appease the right wing, and because of that, it blew up in their face. It blew up in their face. It did. That's what happened here. Now, instead of when we were trying to fight for this, instead of going for single payer or Medicare for all or Medicare buy-in or what all of us progressives were fighting for at the time, the public option. You remember that? Remember the bloody public option? I sure do. Obama, instead of that, pursued this right-wing bill that subsidized private insurance companies, the monsters who created the horrible health insurance crisis in the United States to begin with. Instead of going after the insurance companies, they adopted a right-wing plan and they bought them off, essentially. They subsidized them. That's what it did. So, we all know this. Insurance companies are making out like bandits because of Obamacare. They like Obamacare. They're making a lot of money because of it, right? So now, because of that, and because of this complicated, convoluted private insurance subsidy program, a typo can potentially bring down this entire law. Pretty frightening, right? And back to the public option here. If you allow me a moment to say I told you so, but I told you so. Do you think maybe right now President Obama is regretting the fact that he bargained away the public option? Do you think he's regretting that now? If you don't remember, the reason we do not have the public option in this is, and it was reported in the New York Times, it was reported in Huffington Post, different places reported that Obama, very early in these negotiations, bargained away the public option. He said it would not be part of the final bill. He then went on to pretend it might be. And actually, when that happened, that was actually my biggest eye-opening moment of the Obama presidency, when Barack Obama kept lying about the possibility of the public option, when in reality, he'd already bargained it away, guaranteed that it wasn't going to happen. The reason we don't have a public option is because of Barack Obama. He bargained it away, but hey, that's all water under the corporatist Democrat bridge, right? I don't want Obamacare repealed. I don't want the Affordable Care Act repealed. As crappy and convoluted and complicated as a bill as it is, it still does a lot of good. It still is a lot of good. And I know people who have insurance, who didn't have insurance, who now do. I know people with pre-existing conditions who now get insurance. I know some people who got caught up in the Medicaid expansion. I know people who get subsidies. There is, as problematic as this bill is, and it is problematic and convoluted, there's still a lot of good in the bill, and the good that this insurance does for those people is undeniable. And we can't, I don't want to take that away. I don't want these people not to have insurance, right? So, but again, just think about it for a second, though. Just think right now. Imagine after these right-wing ideologue judges struck down these subsidies because of a typo. Just imagine if President Obama could go on television and say, look, to all of you people potentially losing your subsidies, I know this is frightening. For all of you who are potentially losing your subsidies and your health care because of these judges, don't worry. All you have to do is go sign up for this affordable public option. Would be pretty nice, wouldn't it? Do you think he's maybe regretting the fact that he bargained it away? We'll be right back.